"Run before he comes," said the Apache warrior to the bride promised to a lonely rancher 3 times. Her age. The blood on her wedding dress hadn't dried yet when she heard the hoofbeats approaching fast across the desert floor. Sarah pressed herself against the cold rock face of the canyon wall, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would give her away. The white silk that was supposed to symbolize purity and new beginnings now bore crimson stains that told a different story entirely. 3 riders, maybe 4. She couldn't tell from this distance, but she knew they were coming for her. They always came. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly before her, a brutal landscape of red sandstone mesas and scattered sagebrush that offered little comfort to a woman alone. The sun hung mercilessly overhead, already beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades that reminded her too much of the blood she'd left behind. She had maybe 2 hours before they caught up. 2 hours to put as much distance as possible between herself and the nightmare she'd just escaped. Sarah clutched the torn hem of her dress and forced herself to move. Her feet, still wearing the delicate white slippers her mother had insisted upon, were already blistered and bleeding, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not when she'd come this far. The memory of what had happened back at the ranch house made her stomach turn. The way Jeremiah Colt had looked at her during the ceremony, his 60-year-old eyes hungry and possessive as he slipped the ring onto her trembling finger. The way he'd smiled when the preacher pronounced them man and wife. The way his weathered hands had reached for her afterward, expecting what he believed he'd purchased. But it was the other memory that kept her moving forward through the desert heat. The memory of the Apache warrior who had appeared like a ghost at her bedroom window 3 nights ago, his dark eyes urgent as he whispered words that changed everything. "Run before he comes. When the sun reaches the middle sky on your wedding day, you run." She had thought he was speaking of her new husband. Now she understood he meant something far worse. The hoofbeats grew closer. Sarah scrambled higher up the rocky slope, her dress catching on thorny mesquite bushes that seemed determined to hold her back. The canyon offered some protection, its winding passages and hidden alcoves providing temporary shelter from pursuing eyes. But she knew the men following her were experienced trackers. They would find her eventually, unless she found him first. The Apache had promised to be waiting, had told her to follow the canyon north until she reached the place where 2 streams met, where an ancient cottonwood stood guard over a hidden spring, had sworn he would protect her from what was coming. But Sarah had learned not to trust promises made by men. The sun beat down without mercy, and she could feel her strength beginning to fail. Her throat burned with thirst, and the heavy wedding dress dragged at her steps like chains. She needed water, shelter, and most of all, she needed to understand what had really happened back at the ranch. Because despite everything, despite the blood and the fear and the desperate flight through hostile territory, one question haunted her more than any other. How had the Apache warrior known exactly when to warn her? How had he known what Jeremiah Colt was planning to do after the wedding ceremony? And why had his eyes looked so familiar? The sound of riders echoed off the canyon. Walls, closer now, much closer. Sarah pressed herself deeper into a crevice between 2 massive boulders and tried to control her ragged breathing. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see dust rising from the desert floor below. 3 horses moving at a steady pace, their riders scanning the landscape with the patience of men who knew their quarry had nowhere to run. She recognized the lead horse immediately. Jeremiah Colt's black stallion, the one he claimed had cost him more than most men earned in a year. The animal picked its way carefully between the scattered cacti, following a trail she prayed wouldn't lead them to her hiding place. "She came this way," called a voice she didn't recognize. "Trail's fresh. Maybe an hour ahead of us." "Girl's tougher than she looks," came another voice, this one touched with grudging admiration. Most women would have collapsed by now in this heat, but it was the third voice that made her blood run cold. "She won't get far, not where she's headed." Jeremiah's words carried across the desert air like a death sentence. The Apache are waiting for her at Devil's Creek. Been planning this for weeks. Sarah's world tilted sideways. The Apache warrior hadn't been trying to save her. He'd been leading her into a trap. But why? And what did Jeremiah Colt have to do with it? The riders moved on, following what they believed was her trail deeper into the canyon system. Sarah waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before allowing herself to breathe normally again. Her mind raced, trying to piece together fragments of a puzzle she didn't fully understand. 3 weeks ago, a delegation of Apache leaders had come to the ranch. She'd watched from her bedroom window as they met with Jeremiah in his study, the conversation lasting well into the night. The next morning, he'd announced their engagement, claiming it was time he took a proper wife. 2 weeks ago, strange riders had been spotted in the hills surrounding the property. Jeremiah's foreman had increased patrols and armed the ranch hands, claiming they were protecting against Apache raids. 1 week ago, the Apache warrior had appeared at her window for the first time, speaking in perfect English as he warned her about dangers she couldn't yet understand. Now, hiding in a crack between ancient rocks while her husband hunted her through the desert, Sarah began to see the true shape of the conspiracy that had ensnared her. She wasn't a bride who had fled an unwanted marriage. She was bait in a trap that went far deeper than one man's desire for a young wife. The question was whether she could stay alive long enough to spring it. The canyon wound northward for miles, its red walls rising higher with each turn. Sarah followed its twisting path, staying close to the shadowed eastern face where the afternoon sun couldn't reach her. Her slippers had long since fallen apart, leaving her feet bloody and raw, but she forced herself to keep moving. Water became her primary concern as the desert heat intensified. She'd found a small seep an hour ago, barely enough to wet her lips, but it wasn't sufficient. Without proper water soon, the pursuing riders would find nothing but her bleached bones. That's when she heard it, the sound of running water, faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere ahead. Sarah rounded a bend in the canyon and stopped short. Before her, the passage opened into a hidden valley where two streams converged beneath the spreading branches of an enormous cottonwood tree. The ancient giant stood at least 80 feet tall, its thick trunk scarred by centuries of desert storms and Apache arrows. And sitting beneath it, as motionless as carved stone, was the warrior who had set everything in motion. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35 years old, with the lean build of a man who lived by hunting and riding. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, held back by a leather band decorated with turquoise beads. But it was his eyes that captured her attention. Dark brown, almost black, and filled with an intelligence that seemed to look right through her. "You came," he said simply, his English clear and unaccented. Sarah approached cautiously, her torn dress trailing in the sandy soil. "You knew I would. I hoped." He gestured to a place beside him in the shade of the great tree. "Sit. You need water and rest before we continue." "Continue where?" Sarah remained standing, studying his face for signs of deception. "My husband seems to think you're leading me into another trap." The warrior's expression darkened. "Jeremiah Colt is not your husband. The ceremony was never completed." "What do you mean?" "The preacher pronounced us married. I have witnesses. The preacher was not a preacher. He was one of Colt's men, dressed up for the occasion. The marriage was never legal." The warrior reached for a water skin beside him and held it out to her. "Drink. We have much to discuss and little time." Sarah accepted the water gratefully, her parched throat making rational thought difficult. The cool liquid tasted better than anything she'd ever experienced, and she had to force herself not to drain the entire container. "My name is Joseph Running Bear," the warrior said as she drank. "My mother was Apache. My father was a U.S. Army officer stationed at Fort Apache." Sarah lowered the water skin and stared at him. "You're half white, which is why I could move freely between both worlds, why I could learn what Jeremiah Colt was planning." Joseph's jaw tightened with anger. "He's been selling weapons to renegade Apache bands, arming them for raids against settlers and rival tribes. The territorial government suspects, but they have no proof. What does that have to do with me? You were supposed to be his alibi, the loving wife who could swear he was home during the times when weapons were being delivered. But Colt got greedy. He decided he wanted more than just your testimony. He wanted to sell you to the renegades as well. The water skin fell from Sarah's nerveless fingers. Sell me? A white woman would bring a high price from certain Apache leaders who developed a taste for revenge against white settlers. Colt arranged to have you kidnapped during a staged raid on your wedding night. He would play the grieving husband, collect sympathy from the territorial authorities, and pocket the payment from the renegades. Sarah sank down beside the cottonwood, her legs no longer able to support her weight. But something went wrong. I went wrong. Joseph's smile held no humor. I was supposed to be part of the kidnapping party. Instead, I decided to warn you. Why? The question hung between them like a challenge. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face as if memorizing every detail. Because I've been watching you for 3 months, he said finally. Following Colt's orders to learn your routines, your weaknesses, your fears. And because in all that watching, I came to understand that you deserve better than to be used as a pawn in other men's games. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. You were spying on me. Yes. For 3 months. Yes. And you decided to betray your partners because you felt sorry for me. Joseph's expression grew serious. Not sorry for you. I felt something much more dangerous than that. The implications of his words settled between them like heat shimmer on the desert floor. Sarah found herself studying his face, noting the high cheekbones and strong jaw, the way his eyes seemed to hold depths she hadn't noticed before. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now we have to stay alive long enough to reach Fort Apache. There's an honest commanding officer there who's been trying to build a case against Colt for months. With your testimony about the fake marriage and what you overheard at the ranch, we might have enough evidence to stop him. How far is the fort? 2 days' ride. Through country controlled by the same renegades who were supposed to buy you. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to process everything she'd learned. Her entire life had been turned upside down in the space of a few hours. The marriage she dreaded was fake. The husband she'd fled was a criminal. And the man she'd thought was leading her into a trap might be her only hope of survival. There's something else, Joseph said quietly. Colt won't give up easily. He's already sent word to the renegades that you escaped. They'll be hunting us too, hoping to collect their payment and take revenge on me for betraying them. How many? At least a dozen, maybe more. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him directly. What are our chances? Joseph's honesty was brutal. Not good. But I know this country better than they do. And I have something they don't. What's that? His dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. A reason to fight harder than I've ever fought before. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they heard the first war cry echoing across the desert. Joseph was on his feet instantly, his rifle in his hands as he scanned the canyon walls above them. How many? Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. 6, maybe 8. Joseph grabbed his saddlebags and the water skins. We need to move. Now. They ran along the stream bed, using the flowing water to mask their tracks. Sarah's torn dress hampered her movement, and after 50 yards of stumbling over rocks and roots, she stopped and began tearing away the lower portion of the skirt. What are you doing? Joseph called over his shoulder. Making myself useful instead of decorative. Sarah ripped away yards of white silk, leaving herself with a garment that ended just below her knees. It was scandalous by the standards of proper society, but it might keep her alive. They climbed out of the stream bed and onto a rocky ledge that offered some protection from pursuit. Behind them, the war cries grew louder as their hunters found the hidden valley and the abandoned campsite beneath the cottonwood. They'll track us, Joseph said grimly. These aren't reservation Apache playing at being warriors. These are hardened fighters who've been raiding settlements for years. Sarah checked the small pistol she'd taken from Jeremir's study during her escape. It held 6 shots, hardly enough to fight off a determined war party. How long before they catch up? An hour? Maybe less. They pressed on through the gathering dusk, following game trails that wound through stands of juniper and oak. The desert was transforming as the sun set, the brutal heat of day giving way to a coolness that made movement easier. But it also made tracking easier for their pursuers. The first arrows began falling just as full darkness settled over the landscape. Joseph pulled Sarah behind a boulder as fletched shafts whistled past their heads. "Stay down. Don't shoot unless you have a clear target. I can't see anything out there." Neither can they, but they know approximately where we are. More arrows clattered against the rocks around them. Sarah could hear voices calling in Apache, the words unintelligible but the tone unmistakably hostile. What are they saying? Joseph's face was grim. They're arguing about whether to take you alive or kill you now and take your scalp back to prove they completed the job. And which side is winning? The practical side? Dead hostages don't require food or water. A new voice joined the argument, speaking with the authority of command. The arrow fire stopped immediately. "What now?" Sarah whispered. Their leader just arrived. "He's telling them to wait for dawn, then finish us properly." Sarah felt a moment of relief, followed immediately by the realization that they'd only bought themselves a few hours. "Can we slip away in the dark? They'll have sentries posted. These aren't amateurs." Sarah studied Joseph's profile in the starlight. "You have a plan. The beginning of one. Tell me." Joseph was quiet for several heartbeats. "There's a place about 2 miles north of here where the canyon narrows to maybe 10 feet wide. If we can reach it before dawn, we might be able to hold them off long enough for help to arrive." "Help from where?" "I sent a message to Fort Apache 3 days ago, telling the commanding officer to expect us. If we're not there by tomorrow evening, he'll send out a patrol." Sarah felt her heart sink. "If we're not there by tomorrow evening, we'll be dead. Probably." His matter-of-fact acceptance of their likely fate should have terrified her. Instead, Sarah found it oddly comforting. At least he wasn't trying to fill her with false hope. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. Joseph turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. "When you first appeared at my window, I thought I was dreaming. No one had ever looked at me the way you did. How did I look at you?" Sarah struggled to find the right words. "Like I mattered. Not as property or a bargaining chip or a pretty decoration. Like I was a person worth knowing." Joseph reached out and touched her face gently, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek. "You are worth knowing, worth protecting, worth dying for if necessary." The words hung between them, more binding than any marriage vow. Sarah felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed finally spilling down her cheeks. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good. Fear will keep you alive." They spent the night taking turns keeping watch, dozing fitfully during the quiet hours before dawn. Sarah found herself studying Joseph's face in the pale starlight, memorizing the strong lines of his jaw and the way his hair fell across his shoulders. If these were to be her last hours, she wanted to remember everything about this moment. As the eastern sky began to lighten, they heard movement among the rocks around their hiding place. Their hunters were stirring, preparing for the final assault. "Time to go," Joseph whispered. They slipped away from their shelter like ghosts, using the pre-dawn darkness to mask their movement. The narrow canyon Joseph had mentioned lay 2 miles to the north, but it might as well have been 200. Every step took them further from safety and deeper into hostile territory. The sun cleared the eastern mountains just as they reached the canyon's mouth. Behind them, war cries erupted as their pursuers discovered the empty camp and realized their quarry had escaped again. The canyon walls rose nearly 100 feet on either side, their red sandstone faces offering no handholds for climbing. The passage itself narrowed progressively as it wound deeper into the rock. eventually becoming so constricted that two people could barely walk side by side. "This is it," Joseph said, checking his rifle. "If we're going to make a stand, this is the place." Sarah looked around the narrow defile, noting the way it curved slightly about 50 yards ahead, creating a natural choke point. "They'll have to come at us single file, one at a time, until we run out of ammunition." They positioned themselves at the curve in the canyon, using fallen rocks as cover. Joseph's rifle held 7 shots, and Sarah's pistol another 6. Against 8 or more experienced warriors, it wouldn't be nearly enough. The first Apache appeared at the canyon mouth just as the sun reached its zenith. He moved cautiously, rifle ready, scanning the walls above for signs of ambush. Behind him, Sarah could see the shapes of other warriors spreading out to cover the entrance. "Here they come," Joseph murmured. The warrior advanced step by careful step, using every bit of available cover. His companions followed at intervals, maintaining spacing that would prevent a single shot from taking down multiple targets. Joseph waited until the lead warrior was 30 yards away before taking his first shot. The rifle cracked like thunder in the confined space, and the Apache spun and fell. But even before the echo died away, the others were rushing forward, war cries echoing off the canyon walls. Sarah fired twice, saw one man stumble, then ducked as return fire chipped fragments from the rocks around her head. Joseph's rifle spoke again and again, each shot carefully aimed, each one finding its mark. But there were too many of them. "I'm out," Joseph called, reaching for the pistol at his belt. Sarah fired her last 2 shots and heard the click of an empty chamber. Around them, the surviving Apaches were closing in, their victory cries growing louder with each step. That's when they heard the bugle call echoing from the mouth of the canyon. The Apaches stopped their advance, confusion clear on their faces. The bugle sounded again, followed by the unmistakable thunder of cavalry hooves on hard-packed earth. 10th Cavalry. Joseph shouted, his voice filled with disbelief and hope. "Buffalo Soldiers!" The surviving renegades broke and ran, abandoning their wounded as they scrambled up the canyon walls like spiders. Within minutes, the narrow passage was filled with blue-uniformed soldiers, their carbines ready and their horses snorting from the hard ride. The sergeant in charge dismounted and approached cautiously, his weapon still drawn. "You Joseph Running Bear?" "I am." "Colonel Hayes sent us to find you. Said you might be in trouble." The sergeant's eyes moved to Sarah, taking in her torn dress and blood-stained appearance. "This the witness? Sarah McKenna?" "And yes, she's the witness." The sergeant nodded curtly. "Mount up. We'll escort you back to Fort Apache. Colonel wants to hear what you have to say about Jeremiah Colt." As they rode out of the canyon under military escort, Sarah found herself beside Joseph, their horses matching pace in the desert heat. The immediate danger was over, but she knew their story was far from finished. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we tell the truth, all of it. About Colt's gun running, about the fake marriage, about the plan to sell you to the renegades." Joseph looked at her seriously. "It won't be easy. Colt has friends in the territorial government. They'll try to discredit our testimony." Sarah thought about the life she'd left behind, the proper society that would never accept her again after everything that had happened. "I have nothing left to lose. You have everything to gain." She met his eyes, seeing promises there that went far beyond survival and justice, such as a real life, with someone who sees you as more than property to be bought and sold. The words were carefully chosen, offering hope without demanding an immediate answer. Sarah felt her heart respond to the possibility even as her practical mind cataloged all the reasons why it could never work. A half Apache scout and a rancher's daughter. In the Arizona Territory of 1875, such a union would face obstacles that might prove impossible to overcome. But as they rode toward Fort Apache and whatever future awaited them there, Sarah found herself thinking less about the obstacles and more about the man beside her. The man who had risked everything to save her from a fate worse than death. The man who had looked at her like she mattered. Fort Apache rose from the desert floor like a promise of civilization in the wilderness. Its adobe walls and wooden buildings might not have been elegant, but they represented safety and the rule of law in a territory where both were precious commodities. Colonel Hayes proved to be a weathered man in his 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He interviewed Sarah and Joseph separately, then together, building a comprehensive picture of Jeremiah Colt's criminal enterprise. "We've suspected Colt for months," he told them as evening settled over the fort. "But we needed proof. Evidence that would stand up in a territorial court. Do we have enough?" Joseph asked. "With Miss McKenna's testimony about the fake marriage and your knowledge of the gun-running operation, yes. We can arrest Colt and his Confederates." The colonel's expression grew serious. "But you understand what this means. Both of you will be targets until this matter is resolved. Colt has resources and connections. He won't give up easily." Sarah looked out the window at the fort's parade ground, where soldiers went about their evening duties under the light of torches. "How long before it's safe?" "Months, maybe longer. You'll both need to stay here under military protection until the trials are concluded." The implications settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. Months confined to a military post, dependent on Army protection, cut off from any life she might try to build elsewhere. "There is another option," Colonel Hayes said quietly. "Joseph, you've been working as a civilian scout for the Army. I could offer you a permanent position with quarters here at the fort. Miss McKenna could remain under our protection as well until other arrangements can be made." Other arrangements. Sarah understood the delicate phrasing. A woman in her position had limited options in frontier society. She could return to her family in the East if they would have her after the scandal. She could try to find work as a teacher or seamstress in some distant town where no one knew her story. Or she could accept whatever protection might be offered by the man who had saved her life. "I need time to think," she said. Colonel Hayes nodded understandingly. "Of course. Sergeant Williams will show you to quarters in the women's barracks. You'll be safe there." As Sarah followed the sergeant across the parade ground, she was acutely aware of Joseph walking beside her, matching his pace to hers without being asked. The casual protectiveness of the gesture touched something deep in her chest. "This isn't how I imagined my wedding day would end," she said quietly. Joseph's smile was slight but genuine. "Probably not how you imagined it would begin either." "Definitely not." Sarah paused at the door to the women's barracks. "Thank you. For everything." "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You gave up everything to save a woman you barely knew. Your position with the renegades, your safety, probably any chance of living peacefully among your mother's people." Joseph was quiet for a moment. "I told you before. I had been watching you for 3 months. I knew you better than you might think. What did you see? A woman who read books by lamplight when she thought no one was watching, who treated her servants with kindness and respect, who visited the graves of strangers in the church cemetery because she thought everyone deserved to be remembered." Joseph's dark eyes met hers directly. "I saw someone worth saving." Sarah felt tears threatening again and blinked them back firmly. "I saw someone worth trusting." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah turned toward the barracks door, then paused. "Joseph, yes? When this is all over, when Jeremiah Colt is in prison and it's safe to leave the fort, what will you do?" Joseph considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure. I've spent so long moving between two worlds that I'm not certain I belong completely in either one." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe the answer isn't choosing between worlds. Maybe it's creating a new one." With that, Sarah disappeared into the women's barracks, leaving Joseph standing alone in the torchlight, her words echoing in the desert silence. The trials began 6 weeks later in Tucson, the territorial capital. Jeremiah Colt arrived in chains, his once prosperous appearance reduced to the shabby clothing of a prisoner. but his eyes still held the cold calculation that had made him dangerous. Sarah's testimony was devastating. She detailed the fake marriage ceremony, the conversation she'd overheard about weapon sales, and Colt's plan to sell her to Apache renegades. Her composed demeanor and precise recall impressed the judge and jury, despite the defense attorney's attempts to portray her as an unreliable witness. Joseph's testimony was equally damaging. His knowledge of the gun-running operation, combined with evidence seized from Colt's ranch, painted a clear picture of systematic criminal activity. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. As the judge sentenced Jeremiah Colt to 20 years in the territorial prison, Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying finally lift from her shoulders. It was over. She was free. But freedom, she was learning, came with its own complications. Standing on the steps of the courthouse in Tucson, watching the desert sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah faced a future that held infinite possibilities and no clear direction. "Where will you go now?" Joseph asked, joining her on the courthouse steps. "I don't know. Back east, maybe. Try to rebuild some kind of normal life." "Is that what you want?" "A normal life?" Sarah considered the question carefully. 3 months ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now I'm not sure I even know what normal means anymore. Joseph moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring in the gathering dusk. "I've been thinking about what you said at the fort, about creating a new world instead of choosing between existing ones. And I think you might be right. I think maybe the answer isn't going back to something that was, but building something that could be." Sarah turned to face him fully, seeing in his dark eyes the same mixture of hope and uncertainty she felt in her own heart. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that two people who don't quite fit into the world they were born into might find a way to build a world where they do fit, together." The words were carefully chosen, offering partnership rather than possession, possibility rather than certainty. Sarah felt her heart respond to the promise implicit in his proposal. It wouldn't be easy. A half Apache scout and a rancher's daughter who testified against her own husband. People would talk. People always talk. The question is whether you care more about what they say or about what we could build together. Sarah looked out at the vast expanse of desert stretching toward the horizon, territory that was wild and unforgiving but also full of potential for those brave enough to claim it. Where would we go? North, toward Colorado territory. There are places there where a man can build a ranch, where the past matters less than what you're willing to work for. Joseph's voice grew stronger as he outlined his vision. Good water, grass for cattle, mountains that reach toward the sky. A place where we could start over. If that's what you want. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to envision the life he was describing. A ranch in the mountains, far from the social conventions and rigid expectations that had shaped her world. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams rather than economic necessity or social obligation. It was terrifying and wonderful, and completely impossible by any reasonable standard. "Yes," she said quietly. Joseph's smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert. "Yes? Yes. Let's build something new." He took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. There will be challenges. People who don't accept us, who try to drive us away. Then we'll face them together." Joseph's thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands, a gentle caress that spoke of tenderness and protection and promises yet to be made. "Sarah McKenna, would you marry me? Really marry me, with a real preacher and legal papers and vows that mean something?" Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than fear. "Yes, Joseph Running Bear, I will marry you." The ceremony took place a week later in the chapel at Fort Apache, with Colonel Hayes serving as witness and the post-chaplain officiating. Sarah wore a simple blue dress borrowed from the colonel's wife, and Joseph stood tall in his best white shirt and black vest, his long hair neatly braided. It was nothing like the elaborate wedding her mother had planned, with its imported silk gown and hundreds of guests. But as Sarah spoke her vows and looked into Joseph's eyes, she knew this was what a real marriage was supposed to feel like. "Do you, Sarah Elizabeth McKenna, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do. Do you, Joseph Running Bear, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Joseph's kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise of love and protection that Sarah felt all the way to her soul. When they broke apart, she saw her own joy reflected in his dark eyes. "Mrs. Running Bear," he said softly, "I like the sound of that." They left Fort Apache the next morning, their few possessions loaded into a sturdy wagon drawn by 2 strong horses. Sarah had insisted on driving part of the way, despite Joseph's gentle protests about propriety. "I'm a rancher's wife now," she told him firmly. "I need to know how to handle horses and wagons and whatever else comes along." Joseph's laughter rang across the desert morning. "Yes, ma'am. I can see I married a woman with strong opinions about her capabilities." "You certainly did." As they rolled north toward Colorado Territory and whatever future awaited them there, Sarah found herself thinking about the Apache warrior's words that had started everything. Run before he comes. She had run. But instead of running away from something, she had ended up running toward the life she was meant to live, with the man she was meant to love. The desert stretched endlessly before them, harsh and beautiful and full of promise. And Sarah Running Bear, nee McKenna, faced it without fear, her hand resting securely in her husband's as their wagon carried them toward home.